and welcome back to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast. I'm Roland, this is Matt, and we're busy going through Proverbs. A few episodes ago, we finished, or 2 episodes ago, we finished looking at the introduction to Proverbs, which is Proverbs 1 to 9. And starting from the previous episode, we've been looking at how to read the body of Proverbs, which at first glance kind of just seems like a collection of disconnected sayings organized roughly by the person who gave them. And so last episode, we spoke a bit about how we kind of need to prepare ourselves in terms of thinking about morality and ethics in order to sort of not read Proverbs and then discard them as kind of almost touching on the gray area that is more or less just a function of like our tastes and preferences, right? It's like, no, there's morality is not just a black and white issue. It pervades every part of life, including the gray areas, and we need a more nuanced and more complicated framework for ethics, a more ancient framework for ethics, I suppose you could say, in order to properly appreciate and see the significance of individual proverbs. We didn't, however, actually get to we looked at a handful of proverbs, but we didn't talk about okay, well, how do we approach the sections of the book as a whole? Like when you're reading through them, you shouldn't. Ideally, you wouldn't just read one proverb and then leave.
There are a variety of approaches, I think, is one of the things that we wanted to just mention. And what we spent quite a bit of time doing in the previous episode was taking a proverb and just exploring, okay, well, what are some of the ways that we could think about this? How does this inform our moral framework and our moral sensibilities if we just inhabit the world of this proverb? And I think that's a valid approach.
Yeah.
I think we can take a proverb on its own and just explore. These proverbs gain traction for a reason. There's a reason that this proverb in particular made it into the book, and maybe something else that was just somebody's quip one day just got forgotten and left to fade into obscurity. I think there's a quote that says something along the lines of a proverb is the wisdom of many combined with the wit of one.
Okay.
Something along those lines.
Right.
And I think that quite well summarizes what it is that we've got here. We've got this this rich wisdom of here's a feature of life, the universe, and everything that that we can actually see has value and might help us to think about things. But the fact of the matter is, while we can do that with each proverb, we've also got proverbs kind of clustered together organized together into this book. And we want to think in this episode about what do we do with them when we've got a bunch of proverbs together? What do we do with the collection of proverbs rather than just this individual proverb?
Yeah, I think when you read through Proverbs, you get 2 senses, right? Sometimes if you're reading through like a section, you'll be like, okay, these 5 or so proverbs tend to be related to each other. They seem to be roughly talking about the same thing, like wealth or friendship or whatever.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes me, as a person who's very big into like structure, right? I want to organize things like that. But then the book kind of seems to like circle through all sorts of different topics and then come back to them. So then it's like there'll be proverbs about friendship here, and then there'll be proverbs about friendship in 2 chapters, and then there'll be a proverb about friendship connected with other things. And so as someone who wants to put everything, naturally wants to put everything into like a linear structure, it's sometimes difficult for me to know, like, what am I supposed to be doing? Is the way that I'm supposed to be reading this, like, am I supposed to be collecting all of the ones that talk about a particular topic and read those? Or is there an importance to the fact that he moves from, I don't know, wealth to talking about righteousness to talking about friendship? Like, is that
No, absolutely. And people have been wrestling with this for years. And you've got, on the one end of the spectrum, you've got those who are saying Proverbs is very carefully organized. You've got these collections or clusters that are intentionally put together and are mutually interpretive, and we need to pay attention to those sorts of things. So you've got people like Knut Heim, who that was his PhD thesis.
Okay.
It's now published as a book, like Grapes of Gold Set in Silver, where he's arguing that the Proverbs make bunches of grapes, essentially.
Okay.
That maybe kind of come together on a vine. I haven't actually read the book because it's bloody expensive. So I don't have access to it. But that seems to be his overriding thesis. On the other hand, you've got people like Tramper Longman who want to say, no, actually, I don't agree with Heim. It's just a collection. And you need to take each one on its own. And maybe we find that...
each proverb on its own.
Yeah, each proverb on its own. And maybe we find that some of them talk about similar things, but that's not the point. The point is that each proverb stands on its own and should be interpreted on its own. And you can see that in the way that he actually then structures his commentary. He's got chapters 1 to 9, but then when he gets into the 2-line sayings that make up the body of the book, it's just translation, explanation, translation.
Oh, he doesn't like break it into groups or anything like that.
No.
Wow.
And then you've got a whole lot of mediating positions in between. People who are like, yeah, Heim seems to be onto something. Actually, Longman makes a good point, and sort of... I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. That we've got parts of Proverbs that were clustered together and intentionally organized, other parts that that maybe are a little bit more disparate, or any kind of degree along the spectrum.
I think as someone who's really big into ancient ethics, this is kind of interesting because it seems like we're grappling with the same sorts of questions that Aristotle and Confucius were grappling with a bit when trying to talk about ethics, right? Like if you do maths, for instance, it's very much like, okay, it's general principles and that's fine. So you work on your system of general principles and that's where you are. But ethics, if you talk about general principles, they are necessarily going to be like vague and ambiguous because the details of life or the particularities of life are always going to be more than what you can capture in like a general proposition about how you should act. Yeah. And so you have two options then when you want to develop like a vision for how you should live, right? The one is you accept this fact and you just stay at the abstract and you say, cool, like I leave it up to you to figure out how to work this out in particular details. Yeah. And Aristotle explicitly does that in his ethics.
He's like, he says up front, we can't actually go into detail on every situation. This is not an exact science. Yeah. We need a level of flexibility.
So an example we mentioned last episode was like courage. He says, courage is a good thing. And you say, okay, cool. What does courage look like? Well, it's the mean between foolhardiness and cowardice. You're like, helpful. Okay, cool. I mean, that gives me like a vague area to aim for. And he's like, can you give me more, Aristotle? No, I can't. Because depending on how strong you are, depending on how like dangerous the situation is, it's going to look different. And you're like, okay. So he outlines some things you should consider. But at the end of the day, it's like very situationally dependent and you're kind of just given a framework and now you have to go think about it, right? Yeah. Confucius, on the other hand, he has like a different approach where he's like, cool, I'm going to, instead of trying to build that system, that abstract system of things, we're going to look at individual scenarios and we're going to say, well, what's the good thing to do in this scenario? What's the good thing to do in that scenario? And he's looking at particular things and eschewing like this like sort of theoretical overarching proclamations about how you should do things. But he's like doing it in such a way that he invites you into thinking about the things. So each person is sort of developing internally a model or framework for things, but it's not, but it's through the particular instances, and then you can judge things based on the similarity to those instances. Yeah. And so, I mean, if you do Aristotle's thing, then there's unity seems to be a very obvious thing. It's like this is all unified and packaged and organized. And if you do the Confucius way, it can look very disparate and disconnected. Yeah. But only if you don't recognize that underneath these things are just like windows into like a theory that's difficult to articulate. And so now we have to go figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah. Proverbs seems to lean more towards Confucius.
The Confucius way. Yeah.
As you walk through the book, it's just think about that, do that, maybe don't do that. This is going to end in disaster, so take that into consideration. And in that way, it seems to do a lot like Confucius does and build up a system a bit more organically.
Okay. Yeah, it reminds me similar of like the law as well. If you look at like Leviticus or something, you get like a run of laws and they're vaguely related to like treating other people well. It's like respect the elderly. Yeah. Don't sell your daughter off as a temple prostitute. Don't go to mediums. That's a bad idea. But those are very different parts of life. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, well, those are just like, he's like I think John Walton talks about how he's like drawing a fence around the right behavior. Right. and then it's like, okay, somewhere in here is the way to live. Figure it out, kind of thing.
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would suggest to me that reading groups of proverbs at least would be beneficial, because you're not pretending like any individual proverb is like the window into the thing. You're letting them all kind of balance off each other.
Well, let's start with that end of the spectrum then. With the sort of clusters of proverbs, the relatedness of proverbs, the fact that these proverbs are put together because they belong together.
Okay.
Something along the lines of what Knut Heim has to say. We can take a look at chapter 10. Chapter 10, I think, actually gives us a pretty good example of this.
Great.
So if we start from verse 8, the wise in heart accepts commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Whoever winks maliciously causes grief, and a chattering fool comes to ruin. It's the same line there. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning, but a rod is for the back of the one who has no sense. The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool invites ruin.
That's very similar as well to the same.
Yeah, no, it is. A little bit further down, it actually comes back to that sort of idea. Whoever conceals hatred with lying lips and spreads slander is a fool. Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent holds their tongue. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, but the heart of the wicked is of little value. The lips of the righteous nourish many, but fools die for lack of sense. A lot to do with speech. A lot to do with how we use our words. I mean, it's using metaphors there: mouth, lips, tongue, more explicitly words, a chattering fool, all in that world of how we use our words. So I think when we kind of notice that thread that's running through a whole lot of those proverbs that are there very close together, not all back to back, there seem to be some gaps there. Verse 9, for instance, doesn't seem to have a lot to say about speech, or anything. It doesn't explicitly mention it anyway. But the fact that we've got so many so close together, actually that sort of seems to tell us that they're circling a part of life and trying to draw attention to something. Yeah. And we can start to kind of draw out some principles there. So thinking about how we use our words, don't just speak because you've got things to say. Be a bit more careful and thoughtful about how you say it. So verse 19, sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues. How we use our words matters. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, but the heart of the wicked is of little value.
Yeah, that reminds me of James when he says, like, be slow to speak and quick to listen or something like that, or slow to anger.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm misquoting James in order to make sense of Proverbs, which isn't maybe the best way to go.
It also makes me think of what Jesus has to say about the words that come out of your mouth reveal what's going on in your heart.
Yes, yeah.
There seems to be that sort of idea running through Proverbs as well. In fact, I wonder if a whole lot of what Jesus says in the New Testament, in Sermon on the Mount, and some of the other things that he has to say are a lot more influenced by Proverbs than we often, like, we're very quick to go to the law, and how is Jesus interpreting the law, and what does this mean for works and faith, and all those sorts of questions. There's a lot that Jesus has to say that I think is drawn from Proverbs and wisdom. And
that relates to what you said, I think, in the first episode, which was like Jesus is called the wisdom of God, or one wiser than Solomon.
Yeah, Jesus called one wiser than Solomon, one greater than Solomon, something like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, when you read through them like you just did now, it's like, okay, I see that these are talking about related things, but they're also, like, they're not saying the same thing all the time, right? No. So, like, the one will talk about how the fool comes to ruin, but the other one talks about how the fool will be found out, which can be a different thing. Like, you can be brought to ruin and not be found out, right? Like, your own words could destroy you. Whereas, like, maybe being found out is like you sowed a web of lies or whatever, and then eventually you were, like, embarrassed because
you were found out.
You were found out for that, yeah. Yeah, and then other times it's like, well, he'll come to ruin, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be punished. But then sometimes they specifically speak of punish, but the rod is for the back of him who lacks sense.
Yeah.
Or even, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. So that's like, you're not necessarily going to be punished or found out, but you are making the world a worse place. because you're hiding something that needs to be brought out and found.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting that like these, I mean, they're all kind of related, but it's difficult to like pin down exactly how they're related.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're clustered together with this common theme, I think helps us to join them up together and see how they might actually bounce off each other. I mean, the example that you just used now of, well, yeah, okay, if you could read a proverb on its own to say that the wicked will be, which one did you look at?
I looked at a lot.
Yeah, the
found out.
Yeah,
that's verse 9. But he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. That's what mine says.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, there could be a sense in which that's how things play out. It could also just be that they end up in judgment. But actually, putting those together invites us to think about different ways that they could play out that looking at the one on its own wouldn't necessarily have done.
Yeah.
So we could think about, verse 9 on its own. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Okay, cool. So we could think about a whole lot of ways that we could explore that proverb and think about a whole lot of ways that would play itself out. And that could be in the way that we treat others, that could be in how we use our money, our resources. That could be how we, all sorts of different areas of life. But the fact that in verse 8 and verse 10 and verse 11 and verse 13 all puts that in the context of how we use our words, invites us to think about walking in integrity or walking in crooked paths in a particular light.
Oh, that's
that we might not necessarily have done otherwise.
Oh, okay. That's quite interesting to say that like each of the proverbs, if taken by itself, connects to, presumably because of how, or can connect to like different aspects of life. And then based on how it's placed among its neighbors, it invites you to look at it at a particular aspect of life, maybe more than another. But then that same kind of proverb, the same sentiment, could show up later in a different cluster, and have therefore like a different, not meaning, but like a different focus.
Yeah, it can be drawn out differently. It can have different implications.
Okay.
So the context actually does shape, at least in some sense, it does shape the meaning. Or how it'll be received.
That's useful to me as someone who is always like, why is this coming up again? Like I always like, and it's like, oh, because it has multiple possible reference, and so if you put it here, it's going to look one way, and if you put it there, it's going to look another way. I kind of think of like if you look at, it's maybe a silly example, but if you look at like colored tiles, like of different colors, right? And you put them like near one color or near one cluster of colors versus another cluster of colors. The same tile could look quite blue here, but quite green here, and quite something else here, based on that context. It's sort of the same idea.
Yeah, no, I think so. And because we're talking about ethics, something that, like Aristotle says, is not an exact science. Actually, there's a level of validity that comes with that might not come with black and white truth proposition. That actually there resonances over here that we could think about crooked paths and walking in integrity in one way that is absolutely valid and actually we need to think about. There are ways that we can think specifically about how we use our words that is absolutely valid and that we need to think about. There's a level of malleability about it that I think is...
I like your use of the word resonance. It's kind of like, the two examples that come to mind are the one that connects with resonance quite well is music, right? Like the same melody or harmony or now I'm using all the words I don't know how to use to a music person, so maybe this is not gonna, but like, it could take on a very different meaning if you played in a slightly different key or if you put it with a different
well, this is actually something that really interests me, and when I was studying music, this is something that I wanted to explore quite a bit with some of the things that I was working on. So I was a composition major, and in a bunch of the things that I was writing, like I'd have a melody that was running through, and with a particular against a particular backdrop with particular harmonies, particular chords underneath it, played by particular instruments. It has one sort of character, one sort of flavor you could then just change a few notes and suddenly it's cast in a completely different light. Suddenly it sounds a whole lot darker, a whole lot more mysterious, a whole lot, whatever it might be. And I really enjoyed experimenting with those things. The same melody was running all the way through, but you change the chords underneath and it takes on a whole different character.
Is there a name for that phenomenon in music?
There might be, and if there is, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, and then the other kind of example that comes to mind, but I like the music one a bit more, is a mosaic. Just because of how you have these different tiles that kind of exist on their own, but then when brought together, they show a picture of a particular in a particular way, and then you could reorganize those tiles in a slightly different way and get a completely different picture.
There was it's not quite the same, but a friend of mine had a picture of this big picture of Bart Simpson.
Okay.
Maybe it was Homer Simpson. Doesn't really matter.
One of the Simpsons.
But when you zoom in, it's made up of a whole lot of tiny little pictures from The Simpsons.
Oh.
A whole lot of different scenes that are just coordinated in the right way with the right colors, that when you zoom out, you see Homer Simpson.
That's cool.
And I think it's in a slightly different way. It gets at some of the things that we're talking about here, that not as much the malleability, but you can look up close and see, yeah, okay, cool, that's a picture of that scene over there.
It's self-contained if you look at it by itself.
Yeah, like an individual proverb.
Yeah.
Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. We can look at that on its own and explore that world, but you can zoom out and see how it fits into this broader network and see this bigger picture. That one actually helps us to, it contributes to that bigger picture.
Yeah. That's so cool. Well, if we find a name for this, I'll be sure to put it in the title of the video. If we don't, then ignore this comment and ignore this comment.
Let's take a look at another example. So if we flip over to, it'd be a bit pointless if this was the only part in Proverbs where it works like this. Yeah. We have this whole conversation about how Proverbs kind of connect up together, and then it's only in chapter 10. It's not. If you look at chapter 16, looking at the first bunch of verses there. To humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. All a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans. The Lord works out everything to its proper end, even the wicked for the day of disaster. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. Through love and faithfulness, sin is atoned for, or sin is covered over. Through the fear of the Lord, evil is avoided. When the Lord takes pleasure in anyone's way, he causes their enemies to make peace with them. Better is a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. I mentioned this proverb in a previous episode.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorites. The lips of a king speak as an oracle, and his mouth does not betray justice. On a scale, and it seems to move into something else.
It moves to talk about kings a lot in the next few verses.
Yeah. So running through this whole section there is effectively this discussion on divine providence and human action. Mm-hmm. That you got all these things that people can do, but actually it's the Lord who's in control. The person's heart plans their way, but it's the Lord who establishes their steps. And I think we see a similar thing going on that we saw in chapter 10, where you've got, where was it? Through love and faithfulness, sin is atoned for, but through fear of the Lord, evil is avoided. That seems to stand out as, it seems to be talking about something different. But I wonder if, by putting it in the context of these other proverbs that have to do with the fact that God is ultimately in control, actually throws a particular slant on this proverb that we might not have seen otherwise.
Yeah, as you said it, I was like, because the first meaning that I interpret that from is evil is avoided in the sense that if I follow the Lord, then I will not do evil, right? But then when you read it in the context of what we've just been talking in the rest of these things, it takes on another layer, which is if I follow the Lord, then I will not experience evil as punishment. Because later he says the wicked will see trouble or something like that, right? So the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. The verse 4.
Right, yeah.
And so it's okay, it's got both of these meanings attached to it, which it wouldn't have had that second meaning, or that second meaning wouldn't have occurred to me had it not been grouped in this sort of collection, collection network. I like your word network earlier.
I mean, it's that same word there, and the Hebrew word ra is a little bit more malleable than our English word evil.
Okay.
The evil comes with moral connotations generally.
Yes.
I mean, we could maybe talk about the difference between moral evil and natural evil, as philosophers often do, but evil generally, in the way that we usually use the word, comes with moral connotations, whereas the word ra in the Hebrew can mean evil. It could also just mean bad or disastrous. Or disaster, or something along those lines. So actually, there does seem to be a bit more malleability there, or a bit more ambiguity there in verse 6. The other thing is that we can have confidence that even when the situation looks like we should just deck the guy, we should rather respond with love and faithfulness and the fear of the Lord, because actually God is in control and we can trust him with the situation. Maybe providing a motivation for a particular course of action. It's all things that we can explore, but that particular slant that's thrown on it through the rest of these Proverbs, I think.
Yeah, this is quite a powerful way of reading about it. It's like kind of leaning into the idea that these Proverbs, as like these isolated short sayings, are kind of these like vague puzzle pieces that have like a certain range of meaning, but can have a deeper or like different range of meaning depending on where they're placed.
Yeah.
And then it's like leaning into that and saying, okay, well, how have they been placed? And then using that as like another layer of reflection on top of the individual proverb that you might have thought of. Are the sections themselves also, can they be thought of like that? So we just said he goes from talking about God's providence to talking about kings. And before that, he was talking about, I don't know what he was talking about, learning from God, I guess, because I see a lot about the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer. God, here's the life-giving reproof I see being mentioned.
There seems to be quite a bit of mention of wisdom.
Yeah. So I wonder if you can just take it up another layer. Like you just like keep going up with the layers.
I guess I was sort of wondering that too. And I think it's something worth exploring. I don't know that we'll have time to do it now, but what I was sort of glancing ahead for, it starts to talk about in verse 12. It starts to talk about kings. Kings detest wrongdoing, for a throne is established through righteousness. Kings take pleasure in honest lips. A king's wrath is a messenger of death. A king's face brightens, it means life. There is another proverb that it doesn't actually look like it's here, where it talks about the heart of a king is a stream in the Lord's hand, or something along those lines. Yeah. Aquinas quotes it a lot.
Yeah.
He seems to like that one. I almost would have expected to find it here.
Yes.
Given the fact that we've seemed to move from God's providence into thoughts about the king.
Yeah, totally. I also would have expected to see it there.
But I don't. I think it's further along.
Now we're gonna get nerd sniped looking for it.
I think there's still something to be said for even if that particular proverb comes up later. I mean, that would have been a really nice segue. So whoever edited Proverbs, you dropped the ball there.
Yeah, come on, guy.
But I mean, I think it still does invite reflection. That thing. I mean,
you mean how the sections go from one to the next?
Yeah, and thinking, like, taking a look at where was it? A king's wrath is a messenger of death, but the wise will appease it. Or there was another one that I was looking at. Kings take pleasure in honest lips. They value the one who speaks what is right. There seems to be at least the possibility that the king could enforce justice, or the king could be responsible for that.
Yeah, it's interesting that... Yeah,
and then intersects with what we saw earlier of the Lord works out everything to his proper end, even the wicked for the day of disaster. And you can kind of... It doesn't take much to imagine situations where those two ideas might coalesce. Where the way that you deal with the king and the way that God might be directing the situation to bring about the destruction of the wicked or whatever, you can see how these actually might come together. Or in the case of a bad king, might offer confidence despite the fact that you've got a king that actually isn't towing the line here.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, a lot of the time kings are understood as like agents of God put in place to, be agents, like sources of justice. But then again, they can be corrupt.
But then you got the Book of Kings, which is talking about a whole lot of kings that actually do exactly the opposite of what God expects.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. There's like they have shared meaning, but then also they play against each other and come to a more nuanced appreciation of different aspects.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think effectively what we've done in this episode is not to be like, this is how you understand these proverbs, but inviting people into a way of reading the Book of Proverbs, and basically to say, try this at home and see what happens.
Yeah, I like this because I always find the principalizing approach, where you kind of like read a proverb in isolation, trying to discern the principle underneath it, and then move to the next one, and then try to discern the principle underneath it.
Yeah,
I find that a lot of the time it's like there's too much flexibility in the proverb, and I could just draw, like one person could draw one principle, and I could draw a completely different principle, and it's like, well, is that really what I'm supposed to be doing? Whereas like this idea of like, letting a group of proverbs together, like draw like a vague but still well-defined, semi-directed circle around an area, and then have me meditate on that, and then also help me meditate then on the individual proverbs within that context.
Yeah,
is quite a helpful guide that is less, I don't know, freeform or like able to go in any direction.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of another book where there's a guy who's talking about how you've got these proverbs through the book that are ambiguous. You could take it this way, or you could take it this way, or you could take it this other way. And what he's wanting to say is, well, that creates quite a hermeneutical challenge, for quite an interpretive difficulty for the Book of Proverbs. So what he wants to do is then to say, okay, well, Proverbs 1 to 9 lays out the framework for us. If we look at Proverbs 1 to 9, then we can see not quite an instruction manual, but a framework for how Proverbs tends to shape its perspectives on things, and we can bring that to bear on these individual proverbs. Some of the time I think it works. Some of the time, actually just look at the proverbs around. If you look at the one just before, the one just after, maybe kind of two before, two after, that even just doing that on its own can help us to see, well, yeah, sure, just reading this in isolation, I could let my imagination run wild and go over there, but I could also just look at it in its context and see how this might rein it in. So on one level, I think what we were saying earlier still stands, that there is a level of malleability about these proverbs, that you can see it in this context, you can see it in that context, and there are a bunch of twice told proverbs that appear more than once in the book that seem to be doing just that. But on the other hand, we do need to recognize that we're coming to the Book of Proverbs after several thousand years. At least 2,000 or 2,500, probably more for most of them. That there are some cultural differences that we need to be able to account for. And having the book help to interpret itself is a way that we could do that.
Yeah, kind of correct for our modern biases.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Are we going to end it there?
I think we can end it then.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, click the notification bell, and give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Hey, you got it.
Yeah.
We will see you in the next one.